Hi, Focus families. Thanks so much for joining us today. We've got Anna Maki here to talk about some of the basics of Social Security. So hopefully y'all get some great information. We do have a question and answer section open that you should see on your screen, so you can type in your questions. We'll be able to get to those at the end. And we will be recording today. So if you miss anything, we'll have it up archived on our website. Hopefully by early this afternoon. So without any further ado, I'm going to send it over to Anna.
Hi, everyone. I appreciate y'all taking the time out to be on our call today. I think as we go into this session today, there's a fair number of slides. I know there's a lot of questions about Social Security. And there's a lot of opportunity to spill over into other areas. I think a lot of your questions will probably be answered in some of the slides. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to just request that you have the questions at the end, or just put them in that chat box. But I really appreciate you having me on the call today. And just to give you a little bit of insight into my background, I work with the Bobby Dodd Institute. We started up the Benefits Navigation Program back in 2016. Since that time, we have been able to secure quite a bit of funding for families. I'll be very honest, it was never really my intention to become a Social Security person, but that's what the need is. And as we got into the process of identifying what some gaps were for folks, we discovered that Social Security was a huge one. There are certain disabilities that are kind of difficult to get Social Security for, so being able to provide some support to families was something that was very important to us. So I'm very fortunate. I have a great background to help with advocacy for families. I went to law school at the University of Georgia and got a master's in clinical counseling. So I basically use both skill sets as I'm working for advocacy issues on behalf of individuals that we serve. Put a picture there of Eric. He's my son and my inspiration. So everything that I have learned, I feel like I have learned the hard way. Just trying to traverse all of these different rabbit warrens and rabbit holes that is our benefit system here in Georgia. So I'm hoping that this session today will add some clarity, at least for the Social Security part of things. What we're going to discuss today is helping you to understand just some of the basics of Social Security, primarily understanding the difference between supplemental security income, which is SSI, and Social Security Disability Insurance, which is SSDI. A lot of times when people think Social Security and disability, they're thinking SSDI, and generally when we're talking about our loved ones who are becoming adults in their own right, but don't have a source of income and haven't worked, we're almost always talking about SSI, supplemental security income. We're going to talk about means testing and how that works and things that you need to watch out for there. We're going to focus on the two core resources of Social Security that are accessible to you. If you have are able to Google as we talk, you can Google Blue Book for Social Security, and you can put in whatever disability condition that may be, and you'll see the criteria for that condition and establishing the severity and impact. We'll also talk about the Red Book. The Red Book is for when you are actually having had Social Security and now you want to start to work. So the Blue Book and the Red Book, we're going to go into some detail about how those resources work for us. And then we're going to get into some of the pragmatics about how to build a successful case. What are you really looking at? What materials do you need? What documentation do you need to provide, and so forth. So hopefully at the end of our session today, you'll have a good understanding of what some of the core basic tenets of Social Security are as it relates to our guys. So let's jump in with talking about the difference between SSI and SSDI. So supplemental security income is a needs-based program, and because it's a needs-based program, you have to go through the means testing. So when you're looking at means testing, how that looks like is when you go to the Social Security office to complete your intake, they're going to ask a bunch of questions regarding income and especially about resources. So there is a cap on the amount of resources or assets an individual can have and also be eligible for SSI. So that cap is $2,000. So what you want to make sure is that as you are preparing for your child's application, make sure that you're looking at the resources. If you have a bank account that has more than $2,000 in it, or a savings account with more than $2,000 in it, or any other assets more than $2,000, that may preclude the individual from being able to have eligibility from that means testing perspective. So one of the big issues that we see as it relates to countable resources is child support. So child support is viewed as the individual's income. So the only way to get around that child support as income issue is to have in that separation agreement that the child support is going directly into a supplemental needs trust. So having a supplemental needs trust is going to be a wonderful way to be able to maintain a safe harbor for the lifetime of your loved one, and so is an ABLE account. So what you always want to be able to do is understand, first of all, you can never go over 2,000 and maintain your SSI and Medicaid, because keep in mind, Medicaid is married to SSI. So if you have, it's for many folks, it's not just about the income that you're getting with Social Security, it's about having that health insurance that goes with that. So you always want to make sure that you have Medicaid, especially if your loved one is going to, down the road, need a now comp waiver. That's a Medicaid waiver, so you'll have to have Medicaid in order to have a Medicaid waiver. So having access to Medicaid is really, and just highlight how important that is. So that does get you into the realm of why you would need to have a supplemental needs trust or an ABLE account in order to maintain these safe harbors so that you're going to be able to pass that means testing. So if you haven't had a supplemental needs trust set up, that would definitely be something that you want to consider doing. I would make a note that BDI is the home of the Georgia Community Trust, which is a very cost-effective way to set up a supplemental needs trust. In addition to a supplemental needs trust, I strongly encourage you to set up an ABLE account. And an ABLE account is very similar to that supplemental needs trust in that you can put money into that without it being viewed as a countable resource. So anytime that we're talking about Social Security, we need to look at countable resources and countable income. So it's going to be very important for you to be familiar with those terms and be familiar and savvy about how you're calculating the funding and how you are able to manage your resources without it negatively impacting you. So what I would advise is that once you are awarded SSI, is that you very carefully review monthly the bank account that you have set up as that rep payee, making sure that you have a means to ensure that it never goes over that 2,000 mark, and just be very judicious with that. Again, the supplemental needs trust and the ABLE accounts, these are great ways ways for you to have funding available for your child without it being viewed as accountable resource. In addition to looking at resources, the intake process regarding the means testing is going to focus on limited income. So one of the questions that I frequently get is, can you work and have SSI? Can work? How much can you work? Many hours a week? It's not about the number of hours, it's about how much you're earning. So if you were earning $20 an hour for 10 hours, that's going to be very different than earning $5 an hour for 30 hours. So it's not about the number of hours, it's all about how much money that is, how much that income is. And so that income needs to never go over the substantial gainful activity threshold. You need to view that substantial gainful activity threshold as like this big line in the sand that you can never cross. If you cross that line, then you are deemed ineligible for Social Security, no matter what your disability is. So look at that substantial gainful activity line. It's $1,260. And it goes up every year. It was $1,240 and now it's $1,260. So it does go up every year. But this is $1,260 in countable income. So it's not a dollar for dollar match. Basically, the way Social Security is going to count your income is they're going to look at how much you're earning. They're going to take some standard deductions off, and then they're going to divide that by half. So just if you're roughly guessing, just take the amount of gross income that you're getting and divide it by half, and that's going to be roughly that number that you want to look at for determining how you are earning in comparison to that substantial gainful activity threshold. So just know the number is $1,260. So when you're applying for SSI and you do get that award, the maximum amount that you would receive is $783. So individuals are going to get three types of income. They're going to get either the maximum amount of $783, which is showing that they are not being subsidized by their parents and they are not working or they don't have any other form of income. So that's going to be the maximum, $783. Many times with that initial award, when the individual is living at home, that individual is being viewed as being subsidized by the family. So Social Security is going to take off a third of that income as a deduction. So they call that the 1/3 reduction. It's sort of a presumptive thing. They're going to presume that if you're still living at home with your family, that the family is taking care of your food and shelter. So they'll automatically take off 1/3. You can rebut that presumption by providing a copy of a contract, like a leasehold agreement, as well as proof that the individual is actually paying rent to you, and you can get that increase. Sometimes people try to do that all in one fell swoop. I sometimes struggle with Social Security, so it's just easier to focus first on getting the initial award, and then once we gotten the award, then we immediately go back and request the increase. So the third way that you might see a different number is when an individual is working. So they'll take that full award and then they'll apply the countable income, take those deductions, and then that gives the individual their check. Again, I want to stress that SSI is tied to Medicaid. I think as parents, one of the things that we look at in terms of our long-term needs for our children, we need them to have some form of income, we need them to have some form of health insurance, and we need them to have some level of services. So Social Security knocks out two of the big three concerns that we have, because it does provide the income and it does provide access to health insurance. So that's pretty much SSI in a nutshell. Let's talk next about Ssdi. So Social Security Disability Insurance. I see a lot of memes out there where people get really angry talking about Social Security as an entitlement program, and the reality is it is an entitlement program. Social Security was created by an act of legislature. When we are working, the contributions that we are making to the Social Security Trust Fund in the form of those FICA Social Security taxes, that's what's funding Social Security. And because we've put money into it, we're entitled to get money back out of it. So that's why it's an entitlement program. So the amount of Ssdi is different than SSI. SSI is always going to be that 783, or that taking the 1/3 off, or making some of those manipulations because the individual is working. Ssdi is based instead on the individual's work credit record. So when you establish your loved one as an adult disabled child or an adult dependent child, then once you retire and you're drawing Social Security, then they'll ask the magic question, which is, do you have a child with a disability? And you answer yes. Well, yes, I do. And then that links your files, and then your child is able to pull 50% of your work record. So frequently when that happens, we see individuals transitioning out of SSI into Ssdi because the amount that they're getting off of their parents' work record is more than that 783 cap of SSI. And that's a good thing in that the individual is going to be able to have more income. It's a scary thing because it could bump the individual off of Medicaid, because while SSI is tied to Medicaid, Ssdi is tied to Medicare. And there's a 25-month waiting period for Medicare coverage. So once you're eligible for Medicare off of, because of that transition, there's going to be this gap in time before that Medicare kicks in, and that can be very scary to have no health coverage, particularly for individuals who are reliant on waiver services. Remember, they're always going to have to maintain their Medicaid in order to maintain eligibility for now comp waiver. So in those instances, what we look out for is ensuring that that Medicaid is able to continue. And this is one of the vagaries of the system with Social Security. It's not consistent. I have seen some cases where there's a seamless transition. We have an individual who's been on SSI since they were 18 years old. They're older now, the parents retired, so they're pulling off of the parents' record, getting Ssdi, transitioned over to Ssdi, and because they have been established as that adult dependent child, that Medicaid carries with them seamlessly, which is great, but sometimes it doesn't. So when it doesn't, we have to make sure that we're kind of circling back and applying for Medicaid to ensure that the individual maintains eligibility for a now comp waiver. And whereas we were able to secure Medicaid initially through SSI, once an individual is on Ssdi, but they still need to apply for Medicaid, you don't go back to the Social Security Administration to request the Medicaid, you go to DFACS. The best way to do that is by filing an MAO, which is a medical assistance only application under ABD, which is aged, blind, or disabled Medicaid. If you have a support coordinator because you have a waiver, or if you have a planning list administrator because you're on the planning list for a waiver, you can get their assistance in completing what's called an MAO communicator, which will enable that Medicaid application to go through not only faster, but you get to bypass going to the DFACS office. And I think we can all agree we don't really want to go to the DFACS office. So just be aware that that transition will take place when you're transitioning from SSI to SSDI. You just want to watch that Medicaid and see if it carries through. Sometimes it will. And if it doesn't, then your fallback is that MAO application. Sometimes we have situations where the SSDI income is less than the maximum of SSI, and in those instances, the individual is going to be viewed as dually eligible for both SSI and SSDI. So what happens is they actually get 2 checks, and usually those checks total at or around $783. Sometimes I see some bumps where it's a little bit higher, so that's obviously a good thing. That's trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to share about SSDI. One of the things that just to clarify is becoming eligible for SSDI. There's really 4 ways that an individual is going to be eligible for SSDI, and that's because their parent is retired, or because the parent is disabled, or because the parent is deceased, or because the individual has earned enough work credits in his or her own right to be eligible for SSDI. And so that's where it gets a little confusing sometimes when we'll have individuals, let's say I'm not working, or I am working and I haven't retired, and my son is working and he's earning some work credits. And so we'll see instances where the individual, because they've crossed that threshold of having earned enough work credits, they're eligible for both SSDI and SSI on their own record. So see that quite frequently. Typically then when the parent retires, that they would then look to that parent's record because it's probably going to be more than what the individual's record would have allowed. So hopefully that clears up some issues around SSDI. Just wanted to define an adult disabled child or an adult dependent child are always going to be eligible to receive benefits, just like I've mapped out previously. Again, if the individual is a disabled person over the age of 18, it's very, very important that we are able to establish the onset of the disability before the age of 22. And where this gets difficult is in situations where it's less of a developmental disability and more of a mental health issue. A lot of our mental health issues tend to present in young adulthood. So we tend to have individuals who are first showing signs of bipolar disorder or first showing signs of schizophrenia or conditions like this at or around 18 or 19. And it's important to ensure that we're able to get that diagnosis, or at least show in order to prove the onset of that diagnosis prior to the age of 22. The reason that's so important is if we're not able to show that before age 22, we're not able to have that record be linked to the parent's income. It's really going to create a gap for some of the families in that situation. Individuals, we tend to encourage them not to get married if they are both reliant on Social Security income, because it could be their income could be negatively impacted if they're married. So that's a consideration to think through. Again, if the individual has earned sufficient work credits by themselves, or if they are pulling survivors benefits or retired benefits off the parent's record, or if the parent is disabled, then again they can pull off of the parent's work record. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarification about establishing that adult disabled child or adult dependent child criteria. Let's talk a few minutes about resources to learn more about Social Security. The Blue Book. So the Blue Book is a document that defines all of the criteria that's necessary that you would need to demonstrate in order to prove the severity and impact of the disabling condition is such that it qualifies for Social Security. So everything is based on what is the disabling condition, and this is where it's not an equitable world. There are some conditions that are viewed as compassionate allowances. A good example of a compassionate allowance would be Down syndrome. So with Down syndrome, all you really need to show is either a letter of medical verification of the trisomy 21. If you have the genetic lab report, that's even better. But you should be able to get SSI in about 2 weeks if you have a compassionate allowance. If you want to know the list of compassionate allowances, all you have to do is Google Social Security Blue Book compassionate allowance, and you'll be able to see all of the conditions that meet that criteria. A lot of conditions are viewed as a spectrum. Cerebral palsy is a spectrum disorder because you'll have some individuals with cerebral palsy who are very high functioning and others who are lower functioning. Same thing with an autism disorder. Autism is a really tough disability to, if the individual has an autism diagnosis without accompanying intellectual impairment, it's going to be a tougher case to prove that severity and impact. What I want you to think about when you're going through this process of applying for Social Security is you're really proving two things. You're proving, one, that the individual has this diagnosis, and then you're proving the severity and impact of that diagnosis. And where a lot of times our documentation fails us is on that aspect of being able to demonstrate how it impacts that severity of the impact. So that's where we really want to work closely to make sure that all the documentation that we have is going to meet the full criteria. There's such a thing as a quick disability determination. This is kind of funny to me because nobody in Social Security can actually tell you what that criteria is. It's an algorithm, and it's an algorithm that's built into their computer system, as the intake representative is inputting information during the interview. There's going to be a section on their computer that's like a little flag, and it's going to pop up as a quick disability determination. But nobody's ever been able to share with me what the criteria is, so I'm not clear on that. I find it very interesting that it's out there, but nobody can define it. What I typically have seen is, again, the compassionate allowance, very quick with 2 weeks. Sometimes with the quick disability determination, I've seen cases where if the individual is non-ambulatory, those cases tend to go very, very quickly. If an individual is medically fragile, those cases are also going to go very, very quickly. But many of those times, those individuals are also meeting the criteria of some type of compassionate allowance. In most cases, if your situation is not a compassionate allowance, then what you're showing is the diagnosis, and then you're showing limited residual functional capacity. And so it's the residual functional capacity that is giving you the information about how that individual is functioning and what that severity and impact of that disability is. So let's talk just a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. I want to share just a little bit about the Red Book. So the Red Book is all of the summary of the rules and regulations that allow you to work while collecting benefits. It's very interesting to me when you're filing for Social Security, you're basically taking the stance that the individual is not able to work. It seems like Social Security doesn't do a really good job of seeing shades of gray. It's a very concrete, black or white, you're either able to work or you're not able to work. And so we take the stance this individual is not capable of working, not capable of performing substantial gainful activities. We're very careful of saying they can't, it's not that they can't work, we're saying that they can't perform substantial gainful activity. In other words, that kind of leaves that door open that they're able to work some, just not up to that or past that threshold of substantial gainful activity. So once, it's very interesting to me, once we've gotten the determination that the individual is eligible for Social Security, then that's when the door starts to open for other work incentive programs and things. So we always want to be mindful of things like Ticket to Work and past programs and whatnot. If you do start to work, you need to know that you can itemize deductions like impairment related work expenses or student earned income exclusion. These are deductions that allow an individual to work and get some of that income back. So for example, an impairment related work expense. So let's say my son is working a couple of days a week, which he is, which is awesome. So what we do is we take his, like if he ever has to use Lyft, we would be able to use his receipt for transportation to work. If he is on medication that isn't covered by Medicaid or his insurance, then we would be able to use the receipt for that medication. So there's a lot of things that are out there that could be viewed as impairment related work expenses that you can then deduct. So you basically go to the Social Security office and go, here's my work stubs, and in addition to my work stubs, here are all these receipts. So you give them the work stubs, but then by showing the receipts for whatever those impairment related work expenses are, it basically helps Social Security to do the math, and you're able to get some of that funding back. So there is a student earned income exclusion when the individuals, and I need to double check, I think it's when they're less than 22. I need to just double check that though. But then if the individual is working, but they have a letter of enrollment demonstrating that they're a full-time student, then any income that they're receiving will not be viewed as countable income. So let's get to the pragmatics of filing. You can either file in person or online. It's really the same application for SSI and SSDI. It tends to scare people when we go to the office and we complete the SSI application, and then less than 10 days, they're going to get a rejection letter from SSDI. So every case, because SSDI is an entitlement program, every case has to be screened for SSDI eligibility before they can look at SSI eligibility. So most cases do take about 4 months. Again, if it's a compassionate allowance, it can be a little bit less, well, a lot less actually, because it's usually about 2 weeks. In some cases, I see a presumptive disability. there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason as to why some cases are viewed as a presumptive disability. Basically what that means is, like, we go into the office, we provide all the information, and the intake representative makes a notation of, yeah, I'm pretty sure that this individual is going to be eligible for SSI, and so that allows for a 6 months worth of payments to the individual while their case is pending. If they actually lose the case, they don't have to pay that money back because, you know, it was the government's decision that they presumed them to be disabled. And again, I haven't seen that. Probably been about a year since I've seen that. This administration typically doesn't do things like that. So what I would say is, again, most cases, if it's not compassionate allowance, it's going to take about 4 months. The core report that you're using as your application is called the Adult Disability Report. And so you complete that, and then you go through an intake interview. That intake interview, when you go to Social Security to provide all the documentation, the interview is not about the medical determination. It's only about the means testing. So the only questions that they're going to ask are, well, let's say not the only questions. The primary questions are tied to resources. They ask, you know, what's the nature of the disability, because they need to understand under what conditions are you filing, but they're not probing as to severity or impact at that time. That's for the medical team. So the intake interview is really focused on the means testing part. So they're going to ask a lot of questions about, do you have a trust? And if you do have a supplemental needs trust, you have to provide a copy of that trust to Social Security if it has money in it. If it's an unfunded trust, then you don't. They're going to ask, do you have any, you know, IRA, any 401k, any savings accounts, banks accounts, any railroad pensions? Have you ever worked in the military? Do you have any mineral rights? Have you ever won a lottery? I mean, there's a lot of questions, and you're basically just going nope, 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 nope. And then, you know, the interview concludes. But basically, they're just trying to make sure that they've explored any and all opportunities for you to have resources housed somewhere, because they want to, again, ensure, especially for SSI, that you can't have resources more than $2,000. So from there, after the intake is completed, they're going to print out a summary of your SSI application. This is very important for any individual who is currently on a Katie Beckett deeming waiver and needs that Medicaid to be continued. Basically, what you show is you receive that summary of the application of SSI, and you take that document and send that straight over to the Katie Beckett unit office, and that extends your Katie Beckett until age 19 or until the SSI is approved, whichever comes first. So that document's really important. After the intake, everything goes to the Disability Adjudication Services. Our MO, when we are helping families with the Social Security process, what we basically do is we're reviewing all those forms to make sure that they're accurate, and we're gathering all of the most relevant documentation and pulling it together in such a way so that when this documentation hits the desk of the Disability Adjudication Services, it's going to be very easy for them to make that determination of disability. And many times when the case goes to the disability adjudicator, they'll send you a letter going, hi, you know, your case is at DAS, and we're going to be looking at this. We may have some questions, so, you know, we may be back in touch with you. And then on the heels of that, you frequently will receive in the mail additional forms to complete. One is a function report for the individual, and the other is a function report third party. That's the one that the parent completes. So there's really two forms where a lot of times folks get down the wrong pathway is that sometimes the adjudication services only sends the function report for the adult, and the parent completes it on their behalf. And whatever is completed on the function report adult is going to be viewed by the adjudicator as this is from the individual, not the parent. So you never want to report on behalf of your child. You only want to complete the function report third party on behalf of their child. Let your child do the function report by themselves. Even if they can only write their name, that's fine. Just never complete the function report on behalf of them. Frequently, the disability adjudicator will ask for a mental status exam. This is primarily when they are kind of on the fence. They think, you know, they're just not clear as to whether or not the individual can perform substantial gainful activities. And I see this most frequently with our cases involving autism, when that autism does not have accompanying intellectual impairment. So if I have somebody who has an average full-scale IQ, especially if they've attended college, then that's going to be an uphill battle proving that the severity and impact, because a lot of times they're only looking at the IQ score and not looking at adaptive functioning. So they'll request that mental status exam. I hate to report that in many instances this mental status exam is a lot of times they use the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is a great tool for Alzheimer's. It's really not the best tool for anything else other than that. So a lot of times our guys will summon all of their energy to be their best self for that 20-minute interview, and then the adjudicator or the psychologist will view that the individual is able to do some level of work, and then the case gets denied. So it's very imperative that we are very careful with what we put on all of the reports, and that you have an understanding of what to expect with that mental status exam, but that we are controlling the narrative of this adjudication by providing the right documentation to the adjudicator to begin with. So that goes to how do you prove your case? So again, it goes back to the Blue Book. So what's the Blue Book going to say is required for that case? And generally, in most instances, it's going to be that diagnosis plus that residual functional capacity. So where you see a lot of times with individuals who aren't successful in their initial application, what you're going to see is that when they go to the Social Security office and they complete the interview, they're not providing that medical documentation up front, and they just sign the release that says, sure, you know, any doctors that I've listed on this disability report, you know, contact them for medical records. I think that's the reason why the initial application success rate is only around 35–36% nationwide. It's because most applications aren't being viewed with all of the relevant data, all of the relevant supportive documentation. So again, if we go through this process and we're filing with the right reports, with the right supportive documentation, we're going to have a much greater likelihood of a successful outcome. Again, we have to show the diagnosis, but we also have to show the severity and impact. And so there may be some additional things that we need to look to, like getting letters of medical verification from the doctors. I know at BDI, we have some processes that we follow, including our own internal assessments to help ensure that we're demonstrating that severity and impact. Let's talk a few minutes about residual functional capacity, because this is so important for most cases. What you have to demonstrate is either marked restrictions in 2 or extremely marked restrictions in 1 of the following areas. And this is mental residual functional capacity. This is not physical. So under mental residual functional capacity, you're showing limitations in either their understanding, processing, and memory, social interactions, concentration, persistence, or pace, and adaptability. So what we try to do then is gather all the documentation and highlight sections that are going to hone in on some of these elements. So for example, anybody who has a co-occurring condition of ADHD, I'm going to pull all that documentation because that's going to point to deficits in concentration, persistence, or pace. Any individual that has a lot of agitation or behavioral outbursts or difficulty getting along with others, or co-occurring anxiety, co-occurring depression, where they're going to decompensate in certain situations. I'm going to gather all of that documentation and point that towards adaptability. So you can see it's how you can look at all the information from IEPs, psychological evaluations, any therapist progress notes. You can pull out all that information and just kind of pull it together to hone in on these areas of limitation. And in so doing, what you're basically doing is, through that documentation, illustrating the severity and impact in such a way that it leads to that positive income or positive outcome that that individual is. Oh my goodness, sorry, my kitty's coughing. So what I always recommend is that you gather all of that documentation in advance and make sure that you file that with your application. There's a similar process for physical residual functional capacity. Most of our cases involve the mental residual functional capacity, but every now and again we get the physical. So we just need to look at the case, establish what are the primary issues, and gather all of that relevant documentation. So what happens if you lose? Again, the national rate of approval is pretty low, but I think, again, if you have a great opportunity to get that positive income, if you are proactive and controlling the narrative through providing all of your medical documentation to demonstrate severity and impact to the adjudicator when you file. So if you lose, you're going to get a letter that says, yeah, we agree that you have this condition, but we still think the individual is able to work. What you immediately want to do is file for reconsideration. You only have 60 days to file for reconsideration. Typically, when a case goes to reconsideration, how the disability adjudicator would ask for function reports before, and would request other information or send the individual to one of their psychologists for a mental assessment. Typically at reconsideration, they don't do that. They're basically just looking at, they're basically picking up the file off of one person's desk and putting it on another's desk and saying, well, what do you think? And so that's why you would see such a dramatically low number of approval at the reconsideration level. When we have individuals who have lost, I call it round one, if we lose round one, we always want to provide something new at round two. So I view all of the Social Security application process kind of like a poker game. I don't play my whole hand at once. I'm playing a few cards at a time, and I'm keeping a couple of cards back just in case we need those cards at the reconsideration level. What I found is part of our success with having such a high approval rate at the reconsideration level, I think, is because we are doing two things. We're again providing that appropriate documentation so that they can see that severity and impact, But we're also allowing them to save a little face. We're allowing them to say, look, we didn't have this new information before, so based on this new information, you know, this is a horse of a different color. We're going to we can see clearly that we've got enough documentation for that severity and impact. So always want to have a little bit of new information to provide with that reconsideration. The reconsideration, again, you have 60 days to do it. There are specific forms that you have to complete with Social Security. There's a disability appeal report and a reconsideration request, and you also have to sign a new notice of release. But other than that, it's basically the same process. What's remarkable is even if you lose at that level, you always want to go to the hearing. You always want to go to the hearing. Don't give up. Don't give up for two reasons. One, because you've got a really good chance of winning at the hearing level. And if you do give up, then and you're starting all over, then you're missing out on a potential, what feels like a windfall because of the length of time that it's taken to get that award. So when you get that award, it's based on the date that you file. So even if it gets dragged out for a while because we have to go to the hearing level, and we just in the past 2 weeks we had one case that was approved at the reconsideration level, and we had another case that was approved at the hearing level, which is awesome, but it means that the individual is getting the income in lump sums over the course of the next several months. Again, because you have to be mindful that they can't go over 2,000. So there's a lot of hope. It's not over till it's over. But what if you win? So if you win, there's some things that you need to know. First of all, it's very likely if you win that you do need to set up someone as a representative payee. You want to be very, very scrupulous and careful about monitoring your resources and assets so they don't exceed $2,000. So you want to make sure that you're using either monitoring that very carefully. You want to consider having the Supplemental Needs Trust or ABLE account with regard to managing all of your resources and assets. If the individual starts working, you want to make sure you're following all the rules with the Red Book. If you've gotten the award and they've only given you a partial award because you know your loved one's living at home with you, then you want to take those steps to get that increase, and we'll help you with that as well. There's two forms that you really need in order to get that increase to show that you're not being subsidized. One is that agreement where you're becoming the landlord and you're charging rent. You have to show the rent that you're charging is the fair market value, and Social Security loves when they see their own forms. So they have a form that you can sign off on that basically says that you are charging your child the same rate as you would anybody else. And so when they see that, it's like, okay, if you're charging rent at the same rate as you would, a perfect stranger, then you're clearly not subsidizing the rent, and so they allow you to get that increase. Just remember, if you do start working, it can't go past that substantial gainful activity threshold of 1260. As the individual is working over time, and their income goes up, the income that they receive from Social Security is over time going to gradually decrease and ultimately could get to zero. You can still maintain Medicaid eligibility even if the individual is not receiving any income if you file a 1619B exception. These are not automatically applied. This is something you have to specifically go to Social Security and request. But it is an opportunity to extend Medicaid for an extensive period of time. Used to, Social Security would have annual rep payee reports whereby the representative payee would complete a form and outlining how that money was used. SSI is intended to be used for basic necessities, shelter, food, etc. So it's not meant to be saved. And so one of the things that they would always look at on that rep payee report is, are you saving any money? And if so, where is it and how much? And again, they're trying to look to see if it's gone over that $2,000 mark. They have since discontinued the rep payee report. What we see now is a report called a disability update report. And you want to be very careful when you get that disability update report. There's a couple of little trick questions on there that will trigger a continuing disability review. A continuing disability review basically happens every 5 to 7 years, but now it's happening a lot more frequently. This administration has been very open about wanting to more or less push people off SSI and Ssdi. So they have increased the frequency of CDRs, and that disability update report can inadvertently trigger a CDR based on how you're answering the questions. The questions that you really want to watch for is the individual's condition improved? And you always want to say that the individual's condition is the same or worse. But if it's improved, it's probably going to trigger a continuing disability review. Likewise, if you check that the doctor has said that the individual could work. So just some things that you want to be careful with. If you ever get a disability update report and you want a little bit of guidance, feel free to reach out, and I can help you with that. Once you do win, that opens the door to get more service programs. A ticket to work is going to be very important. A ticket to work is basically a plan to help the individual achieve greater independence through work. And one of the great quid pro quos that goes with the ticket to work is that if you have a ticket to work, you are not subject to a continuing disability review. And that continuing disability review basically is the adjudication process all over again, so that you basically have to prove that your condition is continuing at that severity and impact level that warrants a determination of disability. So if you have a ticket to work, then you're protected from those CDRs. A PASS is a plan to achieve self-sufficiency. So it's another great program to be able to work, to be able to save a little money, and utilize some of that funding towards some like a goal tied to work, like an education goal or a certification, or if the individual is self-employed, perhaps some equipment related to their business, things like that. So the PASS is usually prepared with the assistance of a VOC rehabilitation counselor. The ticket to work is also, when you go to VOC rehab, they can let you know who is in the employer network as a ticket to work agency. BDI is going through the process of approval right now so that we become an agency that is viewed as a ticket to work agency. And so there's a lot of great opportunities to maximize benefits and resources. So, Social Security is going to be a fundamental program needed for that basic level of income and health insurance. But once you are able to secure Social Security, you want to manipulate any other programs like a PASS, like a ticket to work, like maximizing the Red Book, so that you have the best, most productive, most purposeful life possible, while also maintaining that safety net of benefits through Social Security. And that's pretty much it. This is my cat who you could hear coughing earlier, who is my companion now as we're working from home. And what you can't really tell here is that he's actually sitting on my laptop, which is something he tends to do a lot. So at this time, I'm going to check in to see what questions that we might have.
Hey, yes, Anna, we've got a couple of questions. Should have just pushed them through. If you can get back to your team screen, I'm not sure if you can see them or not.
Right. I am trying to get back to that right now. Let's see. Here we go. All right, so one of the questions is that the individual was denied Katie Beckett. Will this affect their ability to be approved for SSI? No. What we want to look at is, again, where the individual is now, what are some of the conditions, and how do they impact her, depending on what the diagnosis is. The first thing we want to check to see is it possibly a compassionate allowance? If not, looking under the blue book, what criteria do we need to look at, and what documentation do we need to show RFC? Katie Beckett is way harder than what it should be. I have a lot of issues with Katie Beckett. I feel like it's a barrier to services for families. There's so many hoops and hurdles and whatnot. It just should be a little more straightforward than that. What you can use is anybody who has ever had the Katie Beckett or has pulled together a Katie Beckett packet. Some of the documents that you pull for or that you use for Katie Beckett are great pieces of documentation for Social Security, specifically any letters of medical necessity that you had from any of your doctors in pursuit of Katie Beckett is great documentation for Social Security. Likewise, there's a form called a DMA-6 that a physician signs off on, that signs off on the level of care that's needed. Again, that's great documentation for SSI. So even if you were rejected for Katie Beckett, there may be some really good documentation in the application that you prepared that would be super documentation for an SSI application. A question about, what if you're homeschooled and you don't have an IEP? What do you do for documentation? IEPs I have a love-hate relationships with IEPs. I love them because there's some good documentation. I love them because frequently the schools will include some of their psychological evaluation numbers in there. What I don't like about them is very frequently they are written in such a strengths-based perspective that it cuts against the case. So if you don't have an IEP, you're not blown out of the water. What you do need to look at is what other documentation might you have. Do you have a psychological evaluation? Does your child have any therapy, whether it's speech therapy, occupational therapy, any therapy to address anxiety or depression? Is your child on any type of psychotropic medication? So there's other things that you would look to gather some of that documentation. So an IEP is not having an IEP is not the end of the world. Okay, let's see. All right, so here's a question about, let's assume that we've gotten the individual on SSI and then they're transitioning from SSI to Ssdi on the parent's record, and that they have Medicaid. Can they have Medicaid and Medicare simultaneously? And the answer to that is yes. So yeah, you definitely want to make sure that during that transition that you're maintaining Medicaid, so you have some level of health insurance. And again, for now comp eligibility, you need to have that Medicaid. So you want to make sure that you do that through either an MAO or hopefully if that Medicaid has just continued. Any other questions?
It looks like that is it that we've seen. So I'll just stall a minute in case anybody's typing. Is there anything you wanted to leave us with, Anna?
I would just let you know that we do provide support services for advocacy for Social Security. So part of what our process is when we get a case is we're doing a lot of the review of the documentation. What takes the most time for me, I write what's called a medical evidentiary review. And basically, like I'm looking down, I have a file folder right here. We go through all of the documents and we create a document that the adjudicator is able to see what the categorical listing is, what the severity and impact is, and then a chronological review of all the documentation where we've highlighted and basically pulled out all of those relevant sections that are going to map to the residual functional capacity requirements. So it's a pretty painstaking process, I'll admit. It takes a lot of time, but I feel like it's worth it, and we've had some very positive feedback from adjudicators. They call it like a golden egg. Like when they get that, it's like, oh, we got everything right here. We don't need anything else. Thank you, thank you. You made my life easier. So that's the kind of response that we really want to get from an adjudicator, because that's going to move the case forward. So that is a service that we provide through BDI. And we basically, you know, the benefits program, again, we're trying to help not just with Social Security. We try to help with waiver advocacy. We want to make sure that you're maximizing family support services. We just want to set families up to maximize as much resources as possible, because we get that it's hard. I mean, I live it. It's hard. It's really hard. So
yeah, well, we did have
we're happy to do.
We did have a few more questions.
Yes. Let me see. Good question about when do we apply, before age 18 or after. If you applied before age 18, they're going to view the parent's income as well. In Social Security land, they have the means on their system when you're going through the intake where they can note that the date of the application, but frequently it's going to revert back to the start of the month. So if so that's why, just as a standard practice, I typically file the month following the 18th birthday. So if the individual's on Katie Beckett, kind of time is of the essence, we want to file the first week of the month following, but I very rarely follow, because there's just too much risk that the intake person is not going to do what they need to do on their side and is going to revert back to the first of the month. And at the first of the month, the individual was still 17. So that's my best advice for that. If we use information from a previous Katie Beckett application, how old can the information be? There's no such thing as having too old of data with Social Security. In fact, they prefer longitudinal data. Where it gets wonky is when all of your documentation is when they were a child, and that's when they're like, well, that's great, but all of this is from when they were 12 and now they're 18. So what we want to show is some level of continuity. So I like to show the original diagnosis. I like to show like some representative sampling through that longitudinal. This is the individual at 2, this is the individual at 5, at 8, at 12, at 14, at 18. It just kind of shows that trajectory of support needs. Honestly, the more documentation you have, frequently the better. So where it gets wonky again is if, and I had a case just very recently where all I have is documentation from when they're children. I don't have anything, I don't have a psychological evaluation using an adult scale. And so that's going to be hard. It puts the adjudicator in sort of a tough situation. It's like, okay, I don't really have a sense of how this individual is functioning right now. So I would just say the more documentation, the merrier. You just want it to be a good balanced level of documentation from when they were little to how they're functioning now. They need to see, the adjudicator needs to be able to see clearly what their level of function is at that moment in time to make that determination of whether or not they could perform substantial gainful activities. Looking for a compassionate allowance, woohoo! Best documentation, all you need is a letter of medical verification that shows the Down syndrome diagnosis. If you have that karyotype analysis from the genetic lab report, that's great, but it won't kill you if you don't have it. Just a psych eval from school that has anything that says Down syndrome on it is basically going to help you. When you go into the office, it doesn't hurt to remind them that Down syndrome is a compassionate allowance. So, let them know when they say, what's the condition? Like, well, this is Down syndrome. We would really like a compassionate allowance, and that'll hopefully grease the wheels a little bit.
I think we just had one more.
Okay.
The guardianship order and the rental agreement.
I have mixed feelings about including the rental agreement. I'm so focused on, we just need to get the award. My primary focus is ensuring that we've been able to build a good case for severity and impact. I don't know we have a disability and get into the rental agreement at that point. So I tend to take that 1-2 approach. Let's get the award, and then let's go back and get the increase once we have the award. Is awesome. What's even better than the guardianship order is if you have a copy of, remember when you went through the guardianship process and you had to get an independent evaluator, and you had to take your child to this evaluator? Guess what? Those are the exact same psychologists that they use for Social Security, and it's hysterical to me when they are sent from the court for adjudication to be determined that a guardian is needed. They always say, yes, individual. Those exact same psychologist will then say that the individual is capable of working. So it's always, to me, it's always great on the court evaluator's report, because that's going to show that, guess what, we've already gone to a third-party psychologist, that the government show that as documentation. So I love that.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions that have come in. So again, Anna, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it. I hope everybody here was able to get some good information out of it, and we'll get this posted soon.
Awesome.
Anything else before we hang up?
No, just sure everybody has my email address. It's Anna Maki at bobbydodd.org. If you have any questions or need some help, please just reach out to me and we'll do. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for being with us today. I hope y'all have a great weekend, and hope to see y'all soon. Thanks.
Thank you.